Jack overextended himself. He had a dream. He knew if he bought this building or that was a good venture. But financially, Pioneer really wasn't ready for that good a venture.
I've always said, I've said this before, is that Jack's business plan was to go out and spend whatever money you wanted and then pray that God would grow money on a tree in the backyard. That was kind of his business plan.
We had emergency board meetings almost every week, sometimes a couple of times a week. Always an emergency.
In the early days, they weren't well managed.
Jack had a spirituality about him. It was a AA spirituality. He understood he had a higher power, and that higher power was directing his life and directing the agency. I mean, he had that, and he was very trusting in that. I probably not as much. I mean, I trusted more in a balanced budget.
He really was a visionary. And with that vision, sometimes it was like, oops, we can't go there yet. And it was like, I just did.
He was always thinking out into the future of what next was he going to do, and forgetting about where he was at. I mean, he did that a lot.
Jack was not a great manager. Jack was a wonderful leader, but Jack was not a manager.
I was very glad when Lloyd came along because he had such a great administrative background.
And when I went to work there at Pioneer, even the financial statements that I had seen at board meetings had been finessed.
And one of the problems was the statements that they had, the banks really weren't buying them. And so we had to get the organization to where the banks approved of what they were doing and knew what they were doing.
The first thing I found out when I went to work there, that the agency had overcharged Boeing for a year or so, and Boeing wanted their money back. And so I was thinking, well, what am I going to do? So one of my first things I did was I had to lay off a big bunch of people and try to make the agency survive. And Jack, meanwhile, while I was trying to pay the bills, was out buying real estate, and he had always had some new project. So we obviously had some clashes over that while I was his assistant. However, there was always an angel in the background with Pioneer, and that was Harold Heath.
Harold Heath started a business, became Heath Techna, and he was so generous.
And Harold was our board president for 7 or 8 years, and he gave not only through his company, but there was a time before I came on board where Pioneer was so destitute that the 2 leading staff members at that time said they would work for nothing to try to keep it going. And Mr. Heath stepped up and said, no, I'll write you a check. And he wrote a personal check for years.
I wasn't sure that the agency was going to survive. I mean, it was really a struggle, and we were paying off Boeing this back debt that we owed them, and Boeing was still giving us business. I mean, Boeing was always very, very helpful, and we worked our way through that. And one time, though, I thought, we're at the end. I'm not going to be able to make this thing go, and we're just short, and it was mainly payroll. I mean, how am I going to meet the payroll? And so I went out with Dick Hudson, and I went out to meet Harold Heath, who was the chairman of the board. And I said, Harold, I just don't think I can make this work.
The fellows running the facilities pretty well took care of the problems of the individuals. They would comment on them once in a while, but not on the basis that they needed help. They were taking care of it. The problems that the organization really had was finances, being able to finance it so they could stay in business.
And he says, well, here's a note, a bank note. And he filled it out for $30,000 and signed it. Didn't date it. And he says, here's this bank note for $30,000. And anytime you really can't make it, you can take that bank note into my bank and they will give you $30,000.
And so I kept giving them money, whatever they needed, or lines of credit, whatever they needed. And it always worked out.
How do you say thank you to that sort of generosity? And he's never asked any credit. He's been very humble. He just did it because he's Harold Heath, and that's who he is.